Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, March 15th. We start our cast tonight with a cry for help from the president of a country desperately holding on as a Russian invasion continues for its 20th day. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky pleaded with Canadians to imagine the terror and horror unfolding in his country in an emotional address to Parliament this morning. President Zelensky addressed a special joint session of Parliament by video link from Ukraine. While Mr. Zelensky says he is grateful to the Canadian government, he adds Ukraine is desperate for more help, including a no-fly zone to stop Russian planes and missiles.
Please understand how important it is for us to close our airspace from Russian missiles and Russian aircrafts. I hope you can understand. I hope you can increase your efforts. You can increase sanctions so they will not have a single dollar to fund their war effort.
President Zelensky says Russia is trying to annihilate Ukraine. The House of Commons was packed for the first time in 2 years, with dozens of guests and most MPs taking their seats. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said it was a show of Canadian unity to support Ukraine. Meanwhile, Canada is imposing sanctions on Russia's deputy prime minister and 14 other Russian politicians and military leaders. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly says the latest targets have all enabled and supported President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There are now more than 780 individuals in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus on Canada's sanction list, and 203 entities, including banks. Ottawa has also barred Canadians from doing business with anyone or any organization on the list. However, it seems that some Canadians still have hope for a diplomatic end to the war in Ukraine. About half of Canadian respondents to a recent online poll say this is possible. But nearly 75% say they believe NATO allies should prepare for military intervention. And the same percentage think the situation could lead to a third world war. The Leger poll also finds that 65% are in favor of Canada imposing more severe sanctions against Russia, even if it means higher gas prices. Well, Canadians who want to fight within Ukraine have been reminded that there is potential for severe consequences. A Canadian volunteer soldier was struck by shrapnel when a military base in western Ukraine was hit by Russian missiles over the weekend. The head of the group Fight for Ukraine says they are making arrangements to have the volunteer soldier be seen by a doctor and get him back home. Fight for Ukraine has been providing logistical information for Canadians who want to help Ukraine fight the Russian invasion. Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children is also stepping in to help in the Ukraine conflict. It's going to take in pediatric cancer patients from Ukraine. It says it has a moral responsibility to provide care to vulnerable children from other countries when capacity allows. Sick Kids says fewer than 5 children are expected to arrive within the next 48 hours. All right, switching gears here to the Canadian housing market. The national average price for a home shot up by 20.6% from a year ago in February to almost $817,000. The Canadian Real Estate Association says supply is slowly starting to return to the housing market and sales activity is picking up. If you take the Greater Vancouver and Toronto areas out of the calculation, the national average price drops by about $178,000. Well, meanwhile, the annual pace of housing starts rose 8% from January to February. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation reports the pace of urban starts rose 10%, with starts for apartments, condos, and other multiple-unit housing projects jumping 13%. Single-detached urban starts rose just 2%. Some good news in the West Coast. British Columbia will soon have the highest minimum wage among the provinces. The provincial NDP government is pushing the minimum wage up by 45 cents to $15.65 an hour starting June 1st. The increase is the first to be tied to BC's annual inflation rate, which was 2.8% last year. 5 Canadian researchers have won $100,000 Killam prizes for outstanding research. Salim Youssef from McMaster University is being honored for his work on the prevention and treatment of cardiovascular disease. Others being honored include Carl E. James from York University for his research on how to create a more equitable society, Dalhousie University ethicist Francois Baylis, University of Toronto nanochemistry expert Geoffrey Ozen, and Dalhousie physics professor Jeff Don. All right, we'll be right back after the break with a look at healthcare burnout across Canada. We'll have an interview with Dr. Catherine Smart, the president of the Canadian Medical Association, up next. That and, of course, more news from around the world. So stay tuned. We'll be right back on Forum Daily. An emergency summit of about 40 health worker groups has heard the level of burnout has reached the point where it's starting to threaten the sustainability of the healthcare system. The summit, co-hosted by the Canadian Medical Association and the Canadian Nurses Association, says that healthcare systems need some drastic intervention from both federal and provincial governments if there is any hope of reviving them. Health organizations seem to agree with the provinces that more long-term funding is needed, but CMA President Catherine Smart says what's needed is radical change and for the federal government to take on a greater role. Well, to tell us more about the current state of Canada's healthcare workforce is Dr. Catherine Smart herself. Doctor, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
So after 2 years of this pandemic, what does year 3 look like for Canadian healthcare settings?
I think it's really worrisome. Even though the number of cases of COVID are starting to decline in hospitals are still over capacity. Many Canadians were unable to access the healthcare they needed during the pandemic. Many chronic diseases worsened, and we're still hearing from colleagues on the front lines that hospitals are full. And we haven't even talked yet about the surgical backlogs that need to be addressed. So there's a lot of pressure still on the system.
Some concerning developments there, ma'am. Now, last week's summit was attended by 40 healthcare worker groups. So what was the underlying message that these groups were sending when it comes to their workers?
Dramatic burnout increasing since before the pandemic across all health professions. It was a common experience, and deep concern for the lack of planning when it comes to human health resources across the country. So I think the message was really very much the same from everyone that was in attendance.
And you mentioned that radical change is needed here. So what would this radical change look like?
I think it would surprise Canadians to know that there is no human health resource plan for our country. So even though healthcare is one of our biggest expenditures, no one's really looked at what is needed to staff the system. How do we meet the increasing complex needs of Canadians? So when we're talking about radical change, we're talking about actually stepping back, politicians admitting there's a problem, admitting the system's collapsing, that human health resources are critical to delivering healthcare, and then committing to work with healthcare professionals around what does that actual system need to look like to create sustainability and to create a plan moving forward.
And you're saying that the federal government needs to take on a greater role in this issue. So what kind of steps can these federal officials do in terms of assisting this issue?
I think we need federal leadership to make sure that dollars are going where they're needed and to actually be able to take a national lens to what's happening in this country. Having every province and territory siloed, not looking at the human health resource crisis in particular from that broader national perspective, really limits what we can do and the changes that can be implemented. So we believe strongly there's a leadership role for the federal government to help us right the ship.
And what about provincial governments, Dr. Smart? What kind of unique contributions could they make in their own healthcare systems?
Provincial governments, of course, are primarily responsible for delivering care. So we think they need to come to the table with healthcare professionals and hear what we're trying to say about where the system's failing. I think one of the best examples can be in primary care. The old-fashioned siloed model of running primary care like a business is failing. That's why physicians are not choosing to go into primary care. And there's a huge opportunity for the provincial level of government to work with primary care providers to look at how integrated team-based care can become an actual reality for the Canadians that rely on it.
So from our conversation, it's clear that mental health within the healthcare setting is only getting worse throughout this pandemic. So what's at risk here, Dr. Smart, if steps are not taken to address this worker burnout?
Well, what we're already seeing is large attrition from healthcare for people that haven't left the system. We're hearing that they're considering leaving the system. Almost 50% of physicians are considering cutting back their work hours over the next 2 years. So if something's not done, we are going to have a dramatic access to care issue. And there's only going to be more Canadians either unable to access care or on these very long wait lists. So it's really the time for action has long passed. We need to get on with actually solving these problems together.
Just about a minute left here, but what about Canadians themselves? We saw a lot of support and recognition for healthcare workers during the onset of this pandemic. So would something like that maybe help the morale right now?
I think appreciation and gratitude always goes a long way to make people feel valued. And vast majority of Canadians have been incredible that way in terms of supporting healthcare workers. I think what people can do now is really let their elected officials know that they want to see governments commit to working with us and to actually getting on with solutions. And each of us has a vote. Each of us can go to the people that represent us and demand that this is a priority.
Dr. Smart, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stay with us. Up next, we'll be speaking with the founder of a nonprofit formed to help in Afghanistan following the withdrawal of U.S. forces that is now expanding its operations to help Ukrainian refugees. We'll have an interview with retired U.S. Army officer and Green Beret and founder of AFG Free, Lieutenant Colonel Perry Blackburn, right after the break. And of course, more news from around the world after that, so stay tuned. Ukrainian officials say 20,000 civilians in private vehicles have left the besieged city of Mariupol on an evacuation route. The situation in the port city has been growing increasingly dire, with food and water in danger of running out. More than 3 million Ukrainians have now fled the fighting, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the war's impact on civilians is reaching terrifying proportions. Meanwhile, as some escape the war zone in Ukraine, others volunteer to help within it. Multiple volunteer evacuation organizations that were formed to help in Afghanistan following the U.S. withdrawal and Taliban takeover there are now expanding their operations to help Ukrainian refugees. And joining us now to tell us more about these efforts made by his own nonprofit is Lieutenant Colonel Perry Blackburn, retired U.S. Army officer and Green Beret and founder of AFG Free. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit more about AFG, sir, or AFG Free, sir, and why it was formed and the work it has already done in Afghanistan.
So AFGFree.org was formed exactly for that, to help the folks in Afghanistan that we partnered with for so many years, our allies, our American citizens, and our lawful permanent residents that needed to get out. So we banded together in these networks and were able to do a lot of good work early on in getting people out of Afghanistan in August, September. After that, we had to pivot our operation to more of a sustainment operation. And we've been able to give food drops, really good, nutritious food to folks in Afghanistan, resettle them within Afghanistan to keep them out of harm's way, and move them on to other places so that they can then go have a pathway to citizenship somewhere else. And that's what we've been doing in Afghanistan. So it was really easy because of our networks that we established to then look into the Ukraine and start helping the people in Ukraine doing the exact same things, except our mechanisms were a little bit different because the borders are open for Ukraine where they're closed for Afghanistan.
So where are your workers currently situated within Ukraine? Tell us a little bit more about your organization's efforts in the country.
So how this starts again is our network is able to have touch points throughout the country of Afghanistan. These are folks that we have known for a long time. And we reached out to them, they reached out to us, and that expanded our network in Ukraine. And then from there, we set up mechanisms for assisted recovery to bring people out of Ukraine and also to get resources and supplies into Ukraine, which is most of our work right now is getting supplies into Ukraine. We just recently got about 6,200 IBA, which is individual body armor, into the Ukraine for them to use. And that was a heavy lift on our side because of all the contacts we had to make in order to get it to the user in Ukraine without being disrupted.
Some very important work there, sir. So what kind of landscape did your team have to navigate in Ukraine to help evacuate these refugees and get this equipment within the country?
So I like to say that AFG Free operates globally because we do, and that's the landscape. In Ukraine specifically, what we look at is working in the shadows, in the crawl spaces. Where can we go to make sure that the folks that we are helping are safe, and also that we're able to get the supplies to the people that need it without being disrupted or commandeered by another faction or the Russians who would also need the same things, supplies that we're giving. So we operate very, very close in the shadow areas of Ukraine, and we work globally to assist in supplying that effort.
That sounds like a very delicate operation, sir. Just about a minute left here, but are there any lessons that your team has learned from your mission in Afghanistan that you're using right now in Ukraine?
Sure, money. I hate to say it, this all works with money. We're all private funded. We're not big NGOs. And matter of fact, that's why we're doing more, bigger, better things than the NGOs, is because we do have that network and we're working in that area. What we learned real quick is you got to get money to the people for humanitarian aid. And we've been able to do that. We've been able to resource sending money to Ukraine, resource sending money to Afghanistan to help the efforts and help the people, the real humanitarian effort that it takes. And we're doing it with all kind of people globally. And that's what's important. It's people like you, reporters that are helping us. There's people on the ground that don't have a job any longer. And we've been able to employ them in this to be able to get the resources to the people that need it.
Some very important work there. Thank you again for joining us today, Lieutenant Colonel Blackburn. We really appreciate your time and all the work that you're doing.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Stay with us. When we return, we'll be taking a look at top international headlines as 20,000 civilians managed to evacuate from Mariupol. Large explosions thundered across Kyiv at dawn as Russia hit 4 multi-story buildings, killing dozens of people, and troops edged toward the city center. About 20,000 civilians packed into cars and left the seaport of Mariupol along a humanitarian corridor in what's believed to be the biggest evacuation yet from a city that's running out of food and water. City Council says another 2,000 vehicles are waiting to leave along the route. A 4th round of talks was held today between Russia and Ukraine. This with Moscow pressing its demands for Ukraine to drop its bid to join NATO, adopt a neutral status, and demilitarize. More than 3 million Ukrainians have now fled the fighting, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the war's impact on civilians is reaching terrifying proportions. Meanwhile, an ally of Russia says its stance on the conflict in Ukraine is completely objective and impartial. China is repeating its accusations that the U.S. is spreading misinformation, with reports that Beijing has responded positively to a Russian request for military supplies. They came after U.S. advisor Jake Sullivan and senior Chinese foreign policy advisor Yang Jiechi met in Rome on Monday. The Biden administration is increasingly concerned that China is using the Ukraine war to advance Beijing's long-term interests in its competition with the U.S. Moving to Iran now, as the powerful Revolutionary Guard has added unmanned underwater vehicles to its navy, according to state TV on Tuesday. The report said this is the first time Iran's navy is equipped with smart subsurface equipment. The Guard unveiled the new vessels and missiles at a ceremony in Iran's southern port city of Bandar Abbas. The equipment included speedboats that can travel up to 95 knots and are able to launch missiles and rockets. Well, there was more military activity to the east. Japanese and U.S. Marines had their first airborne landing and combat training together on Tuesday near Mount Fuji. The two allies are strengthening military cooperation amid growing maritime activity by China and Russia in the regional seas. Japan has been expanding its defense budget and capability for about a decade and is now revising its key national security strategy in the face of threats from China, North Korea, and now Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has intensified concerns about China's growing assertiveness over Taiwan. Well, during these times of war and violence, advocates are urging people to consider the victims. The head of the UN Women's Agency says women and girls pay the highest price in all crises and conflicts, from Myanmar to Afghanistan to Haiti. She added, quote, "The horrifying war in Ukraine now joins that list." Under-Secretary General Sima Bahous told the Commission on the Status of Women's annual meeting yesterday that the war is damaging the lives, hopes, and futures of Ukrainian women and girls. Turning to China now, where antivirus controls have forced auto and electronics makers to shut factories down in the country. And this is raising the risk of wider disruptions if the closures spread to Chinese ports that are among the world's busiest. Stock markets were rattled by the shutdown of Shenzhen in the south, a tech and finance hub, and Changchun, an auto center in the northeast. Controls to access to Shanghai were also tightened. Economists say smartphone makers and other industries can use factories and suppliers in other parts of China. But a bigger threat looms if controls are extended to nearby ports that link Chinese factories with foreign suppliers and markets. Some troubling findings in the U.S. A new study released this week finds children and teens have been steadily experiencing a significant increase in mental health issues. Pediatrician Dr. Alok Patel of Stanford Children's Health says the report shows that heading into the pandemic, we already had a mental health crisis among youth, with a 30% rise in anxiety and depression. He says the last 2 years of COVID-19 has only exacerbated mental illness in adolescents. Some wild weather in Spain. A dust storm from the Sahara is dumping red dust on the country after crossing the Mediterranean. It has issued extremely poor air quality ratings for Madrid and large parts of the southeast coast. Spain's weather service is predicting the dust will continue to accumulate through tomorrow and could reach as far north as the Netherlands and northwestern Germany. Labrador Retrievers topped the American Kennel Club's list of the most popular dog breeds for a record 31st year in a row. The club's annual popularity ranking is drawn from 197 recognized breeds. After Labs, the top 10 most popular breeds are French Bulldogs, Golden Retrievers, German Shepherds, and more. That'll do it for your look at national and international news. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.